Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Kevin Levingston. With me here today to discuss the direction of U.S. international tax policy are Karl Russo and Pat Brown. Welcome, Karl. Welcome, Pat.
Thanks
Good
for
to be
having me.
here.
So let's set the stage with what many people are viewing as, call it, a fiscal cliff heading into 2025 and 2026. Karl, can you speak about that a little bit?
Sure. So the cost of extending the 2017 Tax Act by the time we get to 2025 is going to be roughly $4.5 trillion. About $3.5 trillion of that is the individual provisions, the lower tax rates, the expanded child tax credit, including the raisers like the extension of the limitation on the deduction for state and local taxes. In addition to that, there's about $1 trillion on the business side, which includes the research and experimentation deduction immediately, the bonus at depreciation 100%, and interest limitation, as well as the higher rates on the international provisions under global intangible low taxed income regime and the foreign derived intangible income benefit as well.
Thanks, Karl. Pat, while we can debate the degree of adoption, it does vary around the world. It's, you got to admit that Pillar 2 has become reality in some way, shape, or form. What is the general company's sentiment as it relates to their preference? Talking about U.S. multinationals, whether or not it's current GILTI with global blending, or call it a per country GILTI that is considered a qualified IIR, or alternatively just outright adoption of Pillar 2.
Yeah, so look, there's not one size fits all, right? Different companies have different perspectives, understandably, because they have different facts. If I'm looking for a prevailing view amongst U.S. companies, I think it would be, can I have current law GILTI, but with some improvements, right? And so obviously, notably, that would relate to things like expense allocation, to a certain extent, the 80% limit on foreign tax credit. So there are things about GILTI that companies clearly don't like: expense allocation, FTC, haircut. But I think, the prevailing view would be, I'd like to have what I already have and work to improve it. I think when you drop below that, then and you say, okay, how do you feel about something like, for example, the Build Back Better version of per country GILTI versus kind of full-blown Pillar 2? Look, I think there's a division, but I think probably most companies would say that even though Build Back Better made some positive changes to GILTI,
like expense apportionment.
Like expense apportionment. But I think overall, things like the mechanism for dealing with timing differences, the use of deferred taxes, for example, which is part of Pillar 2, that was not part of Build Back Better. That's going to be a big deal for a lot of companies because they have a lot of attributes sitting on their balance sheet in their foreign affiliates. Those are valuable attributes when you think about the application of Pillar 2, to be sure with some limitations, but they're not valuable attributes in a Build Back Better type per country GILTI. So because of that, I think you'd probably see more sentiment towards, if you had to choose something other than current law GILTI with improvements, you'd see maybe more sentiment leaning in the direction of the Pillar 2 approach as compared to the Build Back Better version of per country GILTI. But again, not one size fits all.
Got it. Thanks. Karl, what about this Joint Committee on Taxation revenue estimate, both with adoption, assuming the U.S. does adopt Pillar 2 versus the U.S. does not adopt Pillar 2? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that if the U.S. does nothing and the rest of the world implements Pillar 2, the U.S. fisc would lose about $120 billion over 10 years. And that's mainly due to the fact that we bleed revenue that we're currently collecting under GILTI as the foreign countries would enact qualified domestic minimum top-up taxes or other regimes that would raise the foreign tax, and therefore the residual to the U.S. would go down. Now, the surprising thing I think that came from many out of that analysis was that even if the U.S. does adopt Pillar 2, which the Joint Committee interpreted as a per country GILTI at a 15% rate, but leaving in place all of the other factors of the current regime, we'd still lose about $55 or $60 billion as a result. And again, that's because the loss of revenue to those other foreign governments doesn't compensate us for the activity that might remain in the United States or that would come back on shore as a result of those changes. So either way, you have the U.S. fisc losing out, but U.S. companies paying more tax, but it's just going to foreign governments.
Pat, kind of sticking with the revenue to the U.S. fisc, until recently, the U.S. could collect a fair amount of money on U.S. residual tax, whether or not it was GILTI or Subpart F. Right. With the rise of QDMTTs and the administrative guidance, it says that those come first prior, and
Right.
the U.S. is going to have to take a foreign tax credit
Right.
for that. Where do we go from here for both from a revenue perspective for the U.S. fisc as well as for U.S. multinationals?
Yeah, so I think Carl's articulation of the revenue challenges, that's real and that's significant. Um, the question, of course, then becomes, well, what do you do about that? Well, if the US is losing money because there are more foreign taxes being paid and more foreign tax credits being granted, we certainly hope policymakers don't move in the direction of saying, well, we'll further restrict the foreign tax credit or we'll tighten up the expense apportionment rules in some meaningful ways. That would obviously be a very punishing response with really severe anti-competitive impact. So the question then becomes, and your question alluded to it, Kevin, if guilty, a secondary taxing right has been giving us a significant amount of revenue that we now stand potentially to lose, how do we get more of a primary taxing right without subjecting companies to double taxation? And that obviously is a very nettlesome challenge. Now we have things like the FDII regime, which is clearly an attempt by Congress to get more, valuable intellectual property or valuable activity that relates to foreign markets in the United States. So we've seen obviously some companies act on that. The question is, are there more things that Congress could do in that direction to get the US to have more primary taxing rights? Or are we actually facing into things like, no, there are going to be further restrictions on the foreign tax credit with, again, very punishing competitive impacts on companies operating in foreign markets. So, there are both opportunities to think about this in a positive way in terms of getting more primary taxing rights while still having companies be competitive. But there are obviously real clouds on the horizon as well that we have to be very, very vigilant about.
All right, thanks. Well, look, whether or not we fix call it a qualified IIR and how we deal with that, one of the things that we are going to have to address as well, or that U.S. multinationals and the fisc are really struggling with, are this idea of these foreign undertax profits rules, that in essence are these foreign UTPRs are going to be eating into the U.S. fisc and taxes because they're undercutting the benefit of tax exempt bonds, R&D credit, and other credits because the U.S. traditionally hasn't had refundable credits. Karl, what would it cost for the U.S. to actually, fix these credits, if you call it, and make them call it qualified refundable tax credits, such that they would not be subject to the UTPR?
Yeah, so the cost to the fisc of making those credits refundable is significant. I estimated that if you were to make all of the general business credits refundable, it would cost about $200 billion over 10 years in the budget window. You could think about maybe restricting that to just the ones that don't have the favorable treatment under the latest guidance. So the energy credits, transferable credits got some favorable rules. If you excluded those, it would still be around $135 billion over 10 years to make those refundable. And the lion's share of that is attributable to the research credit, which is more than half the
Sure.
general business credits.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Obviously, we've got a lot to deal with heading in the next few years, heading into elections and more potential changes in the U.S. and around the world. So thank you, Pat, and thank you, Karl, for being with us here today. And thank you for watching Policy on Demand.